First up, we hear a media report today that the government will be paying over $400 a tonne for coal to come from Newcastle to Collie. That's over $40 million of taxpayers' money, we assume, or is it consumers' money that is going to go into buying coal from Newcastle when we literally have a couple of billion tonnes of coal in Collie? A complete failure by this state Labor government, but more than a failure in terms of providing coal security and hence energy security for the state. Where's the transparency on this deal? Minister Johnson is refusing to answer questions. He should be open with the public of Western Australia. What are either the power users or the taxpayers of Western Australia being forced to pay for this coal that's coming all the way from New South Wales? Another week and another failure of this government to reach an industrial settlement with two of our frontline workforces, the police and nurses and midwives. These are the two groups of workers who were called upon by this government to be at the absolute forefront of the response to the COVID crisis, and yet they are unable to negotiate effectively with them to seal this wages deal and in fact treat the nurses, the midwives and the police with the respect that they deserve. One of the things that's been very, very clear for both of those workforces is, as much as these industrial disputes are about wages, it's about the way they're treated by the government, and it's very clear that they don't feel that they are respected by this McGowan Labor government. In relation to the federal government's IR bill, it is disturbing to hear that it appears that the Federal Industrial Relations Bill is going to proceed. This bill heralds the return to the industrial anarchy that Australia and Western Australia experienced in the 70s. The allowance of patent bargaining, of industry-wide industrial action in support of wages claims, but also the abolition of the Australian Building and Construction Commission is going to hit Western Australia hard. You know, a 6-week disruption of our iron ore exports would cost this state $9 billion, but more importantly, from a state government point of view, it would cost the state government around $500 million in lost royalties. You know, it's not too late for Premier Mark McGowan to stand up for Western Australia and urge his federal government, his federal colleagues not to pass this bill. This is a bill that is going to cause immense harm to Western Australia, and as I say, we're going to go from an ordered industrial environment to the sorts of chaos that we saw back in the 70s. Any questions, issues of the day?
Just on coal, do you think it's inevitable that we will see that price get passed on to consumers?
Look, one way or the other it is, isn't it? It's either the taxpayer or the consumer that's going to pay it, and an unnecessary impost on the, you know, either the power users or the taxpayers of Western Australia. And of course, in fact, if it comes out of Synergy's bottom line, it comes out of taxpayers. So, you know, Minister Johnson needs to be transparent. This is a government that promised gold standard transparency, but they are anything but. They should be open on what this deal is, who's going to pay, who's going to have to stump up the extra money.
That $400 spot price?
It's around $360, but of course they've got to transport it. But Gary Adshead was quoting that figure this morning, and he said he'd been quoted that figure from an industry source. That would be consistent with the price of coal out of Newcastle at the moment, price of thermal coal.
On prices and the effect that it would have on the cost of energy, does the government set the prices?
It does. So if it doesn't come out of the consumers, it's going to come out of the taxpayers. Someone's going to pay.
Can I ask you about the Premier's comments this morning about his critics on Banksia Hill, Fiona Stanley, Carmen Lawrence and a couple of other people who he described as not dealing in the real world, as activists, you know, that they didn't understand sort of the reality of the process.
Look, anyone who gets around the state knows the reality of what's going on. We've seen what's happening in Banksia Hill, and I think most Western Australians, in fact I think all Western Australians have been shocked by that. But more than that, I mean, the gimmick that the Premier can have a 90-minute meeting with a hand-picked group of people and solve those problems, it's clearly farcical, and that's what he's really being called out on. We need a proper and thorough investigation of the juvenile justice system. And it's not just about what happens once the kids get into a detention facility, it's about stopping the kids getting there in the first place. Now, the Premier's announced, $63 million. It's quite clear that that's a drop in the bucket of what's required. We've got a conveyor belt of kids coming into the criminal justice system. What's being done to actually stop this at source?
On the nurses and police, the Premier says that they can't give a 5% pay rise to either nurses or police without giving it to the entire public sector, and they say that that would be too expensive. Where do you stand on that? Should there be the ability to do separate deals with separate parts of the public sector workforce?
Well, look, I think we've seen this in the past. I mean, and that is the government does have the ability to carry out those negotiations. Look, these are the two workforces that were at the absolute forefront of the fight against COVID in this state. I mean, the government was happy to come out and praise them and rely on them. And you'd know, well, for both of those work groups, they did enormous amounts of overtime, nurses and midwives, double and triple shifts to cope with this, and the government needs to negotiate with them properly and fairly.
Should that policy that makes any pay rise be all-encompassing for all public sector workers, should that be changed?
Well, the government is saying that's the policy. I mean, these wage agreements are negotiated with each union separately. The government's made that as a policy choice. That's up to them. Look, I think the whole public's being softened up to expect power blackouts. I mean, this summer, obviously they're softening us up for that. I mean, imagine sending you a text message saying, turn your air conditioner off or we'll cut your power off. It's effectively what they're saying. But the minister's making all sorts of noises now that indicate we're going to face trouble. I hear this from industry sources. It's more than just about now. I've been looking at a range of information recently going forward, and the reality is that this is a portent of coal restrictions in the future, and when that happens, there is not enough gas in the pipeline or that can come down the pipeline to provide power for this state. So yes, we've got problems now, but it's very, very clear that we're going to have some major electricity reliability issues going out in the next couple of years because of the government's mishandling of the electricity and energy portfolios.
Liberal Party's defeat in Victoria can't do much to put any confidence in your party here in WA?
Look, I tell you what, I focus on what I can control, and we're working hard to hold this government to account and make sure that we put ourselves in the best position next time. Okay, thanks guys.